The United States Civil War was the most deadly conflict in American history. An approximate 600,000 soldiers lost their lives. That's more dead than the rest of America's wars combined. But at about the same time, using weapons far less advanced, another far deadlier civil war was going on in China, one that claimed a possible 10 to 20 million people. From 1850 to 1864 and a bit beyond, much of central and southern China was a butcher's yard. Welcome to the Taiping Rebellion, perhaps the bloodiest and most influential conflict in China's history, and welcome to a day in history. Most people know the story of Adolf Hitler and his frustrated ambition to become an artist. Failing to achieve his dream of entering Vienna's Academy of Fine Arts twice, Hitler took to the streets, nursing his resentments and prejudices until he turned his rage on the world. However, not many people outside China know the story of Hong Xiuquan, the charismatic leader of the Taiping Rebellion. 80-some years before Hitler took his frustration out on the world, Hong Xiuquan took out his frustration and resentment on the Chinese people. Taking the famous state civil service exam 3 times and failing each time in his attempt to secure a lifelong position of respect and security, Hong, like Hitler at the end of World War I, had a vision or a dream which he was convinced meant he was to lead China to a new golden age. Hong must have been quite charismatic and able to convey his beliefs well, for not long after, his movement, originally centered in Guangzhou, formerly known as Canton, grew to some 10,000 members. In his visions, Hong saw the Christian God and Jesus and believed he was another Son of God and Jesus' brother. In the 1840s and 50s, increasing numbers of Christian missionaries arrived in China, along with a growing number of European troops and merchants. Though most of China never entertained the thought of converting to Christianity, the population numbers in China, believed to be between 400 and 450 million people at the time, meant that if only 1% of these Chinese converted, 4 million people had become Christian. The governing Qing dynasty was not thrilled by the arrival and spread of a foreign and completely alien religion, but had little choice. The growing influence of European powers in China at the time, especially that of England and France, and the humiliating Chinese defeat against England in the First Opium War of the early 1840s, meant that the Qing had little choice. Resentment against the Europeans, their faith, and their new Chinese converts grew throughout much of eastern China, where the Europeans' influence was most significant. Hong Xiuquan had heard speeches and lectures by Edwin Stevens, an American missionary who gave Hong a number of pamphlets and books about Christianity written by Liang Fa, one of the first Chinese converts to Christianity. Liang Fa's Good Words to Admonish the Age became popular among some educated Chinese and was the book that most influenced Hong. Hong may have failed the civil service exam 3 times, but he was not stupid. Based on Christian doctrine, the teachings of Stevens and Liang Fa, and his knowledge of Chinese folk beliefs, Hong created a peculiar belief system in which he was the younger brother of Christ, tasked with purifying China of pagan beliefs and establishing what he called the heavenly kingdom of great peace. Some groups, like the Chinese Communist Party itself, call the beliefs of Hong Xiuquan and the Taipings a precursor to the development of Chinese communism and call it a revolution rather than a rebellion. Though the political aspects of the Taiping were closely intertwined with their religious beliefs and were hard to separate, Hong and his followers believed in complete land redistribution, equality of all men, the abolition of painful and misogynistic practice of foot binding, and the elimination of opium use, a rapidly growing problem at the time. They also believed in complete segregation of gender and advocated a life of celibacy for everyone, including married couples. Hong's group was called the God-Worshipping Society, and almost from the start, the movement was marked by fanaticism and an unshakable belief in the power of Hong Xiuquan. 2 of the main pillars of the movement were an absolute hostility to the Qing and a desire to spread their new blend of Christianity, ancient Chinese Taoism, and folk beliefs. Qing officials and the Chinese spiritual leaders were targeted as demons, preventing the establishment of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, Taiping meaning Great Peace. By the late 1840s and early into the 1850s, the God-Worshipping Society became a thorn in the side of the Qing government. Actually, they were more than that. In the Yangtze Delta of central eastern China, one of the country's most economically, strategically, culturally, and demographically essential areas, the god-worshipping society spread. For Emperor Xiangfeng and the rest of the Qing ruling class, the rise of the Taiping and other rebellions, famine, and epidemics were particularly dangerous. Rebellion, famine, and epidemics are challenging for any government, but in Imperial China, when they all happen at the same time and the government is seen as powerless to stop them, people began to worry that the government has lost the mandate of heaven, the blessing of the gods. The idea that the Qing had lost the mandate of heaven was a blessing to the god-worshipping society. As their numbers and influence grew, many people in the region began to see the Taipings as being blessed by God and the gods, and joined with them. The Taipings may have had 1 million or more men in arms at their height. Outside China, and especially in the West, the people living within China's borders are all seen as Chinese. However, while their IDs may say they are Chinese because they live in China, the government recognizes 56 ethnic groups in China. The most numerous and culturally dominant are the Han Chinese, but there are other ethnic Chinese groups like the Zhuang and the Hui. However, non-Chinese groups like the Muslim Uyghurs and other Turkic people, as well as other non-Chinese groups like the Pang, Dai, and others, live in various areas of the country. One other ethnically Chinese group, the Hakka, played a central role in the Taiping Rebellion and its leadership. These are the Hakka people, a group recognized as an offshoot of the Han Chinese, but with a separate cultural and linguistic heritage. In several waves beginning in the 4th century AD, the Hakka moved from their lands in northern China to the south, looking for better land and economic opportunity. Unfortunately for the Hakka, the lands they reached were already occupied, and the newcomers and their apparent skill in making money were not welcomed. Most Hakka groups settled in less fertile or mountainous areas outside the cities by either force or circumstance. Despite facing discrimination and persecution, many Hakka became successful and were known for their business acumen. For many other Chinese, most of whom lived in absolute poverty in the cities and out, the apparent success of the Hakka was greatly resented. From time to time, there was vicious, ethnically motivated violence between the Hakka and others. It should be said that the Hakka weren't always the victims. When Hong Xiuquan's beliefs began to spread, many Hakka joined him, though many other people joined the Taiping Rebellion. Even today, many Chinese believe that the rebellion was launched and led by the Hakka alone. Within a short time, open warfare began between Hong's followers and the other people of the Yangtze Delta area. From the very start, the rebellion was marked by atrocious violence. Throughout the area, the Taipings raided towns and villages, believing that many traditional Chinese practices and beliefs were preventing the arrival of the kingdom of heaven on earth. The Taipings often killed everyone they could get their hands on. The first great Taiping victory took place in 1853 when they seized the city of Nanjing, and then the horror began. The main targets were ethnic Manchus, members of the Manchu-led Qing dynasty or its officials who were rounded up and segregated by gender. Thousands of men were speared and hacked to death. The women were led outside and set on fire. Women were tied to oil and fat-soaked hay bales and torched. Some were burned at the stake. Children and babies were killed in a variety of ways. Hong Xiuquan renamed Nanjing Jiangjing, heavenly capital, and led his movement from there. Shortly thereafter, the rapidly growing forces of the god-worshipping society launched 2 campaigns, the Northern Campaign and the Western Campaign, whose ultimate goal was the capture of all of China. The goal of the Northern Campaign was to capture Beijing, then move southwest to meet the Western Campaign, whose aim was to capture the Texas-site Sichuan province and the area around it. If these campaigns were victorious, it would mean that the Taipings would control most of China. At about the same time that his armies were moving off to capture China, Hong Xiuquan withdrew from the day-to-day functioning of his government and isolated himself in a palace, giving directives on issues he often knew nothing about. He also began to live like most of the modern cult leaders seen on television and in movies today. He lived in luxury. His word was law. And despite publicly frowning on sex and calling for complete segregation of men and women, Hong lived with a large number of his own concubines. And like most cult leaders, he began to get paranoid, fearing even the men who helped him rise to power and who fervently believed in his teachings. Many of these men had been named kings of different parts of China and reported to the powerful East King, Yang Xiuqing, whom Hong had said was God's choice as his mouthpiece on earth. As God's direct representative, whose every order had to be followed as the literal word of God, Yang gathered power and, within the inner ruling class, became more powerful than Hong himself. In 1856, after a 3-year siege of Nanjing by the Qing was defeated, a powerful struggle between Hong and Yang led to the Taiping incident, which led to Yang and most of his followers being killed. By the late 1850s and into the early 1860s, the Qing government, with a large degree of foreign aid and a drafty army numbering in the millions, began to turn the tide. Though both sides had some firearms, most of the fighting was done up close and personally. Prisoners were rarely taken, and the dead in some battles numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Worse still, China was hit by a series of calamities, some caused by the war, others wrought by nature. Floods, disease, and famine claimed millions of lives, especially in areas controlled by the Taiping, which covered areas the size of many modern European nations combined. For those fighting against the Taiping, this meant that heaven did not smile on their enemies. For the Taiping, many of these catastrophes were explained away by the idea, proclaimed in speeches, writings, and other pronouncements, that the demons of the Qing and all those opposed to the God-worshipping society were preventing the establishment of the heavenly kingdom and had to be destroyed. In many areas, the fighting was not only about religion, power, and the mandate of heaven, but also ethnicity. In the Pearl River Delta around Guangzhou, the Hakka and Punti people, also known as Yue Chinese, fought an incredibly vicious war against each other, which began over economic opportunity. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 2 million people died in this conflict within a conflict, and this was not a unique situation. All over Taiping-controlled China, ethnic violence, often pitting the Hakka against another group, broke out. By 1864, the reorganized, larger, and better-equipped Qing army began to turn the tide, helped at times by Westerners like the famous British adventurer Charles George Gordon, nicknamed Chinese Gordon in the British press, American Edward Townsend Ward, and Frenchman Auguste Protet, both of whom were killed in combat. In June 1864, Tianjin Nanjing was surrounded, and Hong Xiuquan died of an illness that may have been either suicide or murder. He was succeeded by his son, Hong Tianguifu, who managed to escape the city, but who was killed by the Qing after another violent battle in November. For all intents and purposes, the Taiping Rebellion ended with Hong Xiuquan's death, but throughout the country, Taiping followers continued to fight for another few years before finally being defeated completely. Most historians agree that 12 million dead is an accurate enough figure and that a large conflict cannot help but have long-term consequences. Christianity did continue to spread to a degree in China, especially in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But resentment, fear, and misunderstanding, as well as the strength of traditional Chinese beliefs, meant that Christianity never really gained that large a toehold in China. The arrival of increasing numbers of Europeans also brought resentment, though there were many reasons for this. The influence of Christianity on the origins of the incredibly bloody Taiping Rebellion was also a factor in anti-foreign sentiment and played a large role in the bloody anti-foreign and anti-Christian Boxer Rebellion of the early 1900s. Today, while the Chinese Communist Party commemorates the Taiping Rebellion, many Hakka people and communities continue to face discrimination in modern China, much of which has its roots in the Taiping Rebellion. However, most Taiping soldiers were Han Chinese. History lives on. Thank you for watching. See you next time.